Welcome everyone again to our webinar today with AppGuard. We're very excited to tell you more about AppGuard's different approach to endpoint prevention and the endpoint security space. And with that being said, I would like to first let everyone know that by default, all the attendees and registrants to the webinar today are set to mute, but you can unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question during the webinar, or you can type that in the chat area of the GoToWebinar. For quick introductions today, my name is Janan Jaber, and I'm the Director of Business Development with AppGuard. This is a joint webinar with one of our partners, and we're very excited to have Larry with us today. Larry, if you would like to give a quick introduction about yourself and about ABSI, that would be great. Larry, can you hear me? It looks like you are on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. You didn't unmute me initially. My name is Larry Bain. I'm Director of Business Development for American Business Solutions. And I want to start by saying thank you to AppGuard for recognizing us as a reseller. Just a little bit about American Business Solutions. We're an award-winning IT staffing organization founded 20 years ago that provides IT resources for information security, for development, enterprise data management, and infrastructure services. We provide value to our customers by offering a wide range of consulting services, including project management, Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, and Sun Technologies, PeopleSoft, SAP, and ERP. We're proud that we recently became an AppGuard reseller to offer our clients the ability to take advantage of the most effective endpoint security solution that's available today.
Thank you so much, Larry, and we're very excited about our partnership with ABSI as well. I would like to also introduce some of my colleagues who will be joining me for the webinar today. Eric Iverson is our Director of Product Management for AppGuard, and the format for today's webinar will consist of a brief overview of AppGuard, highlighting some of the differentiators in our approach to endpoint security from a preventative and proactive point of view. And Eric will be going through that and focusing on our technology behind AppGuard. And then I will also show you some examples in a live demo of how AppGuard can stop some of the sophisticated attacks that we're seeing today, from ransomware to weaponized documents and fileless, malwareless type of attacks, as well as memory scrapers that basically aim at stealing data and credential theft, for example. With that being said, Eric, if you could please introduce yourself and start with the overview, that would be great.
Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Just to get started here, I'm sure you all know about the scourge of malicious code attacks that's been wreaking havoc across the world for years and years. Basically the threat has always been changing, and we're pleased to say that AppGuard in all its years has been adapting to the change and blocking all of these new attacks as they come. and we're going to tell you a little bit more about that this morning. AppGuard is a very different approach, as was mentioned earlier, and it doesn't fit neatly into the categories on the right that you might be familiar with. Pretty much all of the name brands you know employ one or more of the of these different types of endpoint protection or monitoring on the right. And again, AppGuard doesn't fit neatly or well at all into any of these approaches. It's very different. And because it's very different, that is why it is so very effective. And so maybe it helps to say what AppGuard does not do. Well, AppGuard does not try to tell good from bad files or normal from abnormal like other products do. The reason AppGuard does not try to do that is because the possibilities are literally infinite, and that's a losing battle from the get-go. Instead, AppGuard focuses on blocking those unacceptable actions that the adversary must do on the endpoint to achieve his or her goals. So there, right away, we're simplifying the problem from infinity down to a very nice, workable, finite number of actions that we have to block. And we're doing that with kernel-level controls that make better use of the existing controls within the operating system, augmenting them where we must, and again, blocking those unacceptable actions by the adversary when they launch their malicious code attacks on enterprise endpoints. Let's see, another thing that sets AppGuard apart from some of these products on the right-hand side is take application whitelisting, for example. That approach, which is basically don't let anything unknown launch, has two major flaws to it. One flaw is once something known and familiar and validated is allowed to launch, such as, say, Microsoft Word, it does nothing to contain or restrict what Microsoft Word does after it launches. That's a problem. The other thing is from an operational perspective, and that is the application whitelist has to perfectly understand what the endpoint is supposed to be. If it doesn't, things go wrong and users are disrupted. Another thing AppGuard doesn't try to do is, if you're familiar with the notion of zero-day attacks, polymorphic malware, those are exploiting vulnerabilities in software applications and then basically trying to hijack them and make them do bad things. We're not trying to prevent that exploit from occurring. What we're preventing is that exploit from doing harmful actions. It's much simpler and ultimately much more effective at protecting the enterprise's interests. So, generally speaking, just about everything you've seen in the headlines, every article you've read about malicious code attacks, they all fall into these four basic categories. You're probably familiar, whether you know it or not, with the top category there, application exploit attacks. The next one down you might not recognize because different people use different names for it. But these are the attacks where the legitimate utilities or applications within your endpoints are used by the adversary to do their harmful actions. PowerShell, macro, WMI, and others. They make use of those things, those legitimate tools. And then, again, as I mentioned earlier, application whitelisting. That was adopted rather widespread in the last decade, but as a result of that, the adversaries adapted their tactics, and what they did was they moved to code injections, memory scraping, and other in-memory actions that are basically outside the scope of application whitelisting's controls. And then finally, of course, social engineering That's less common in the enterprise than in the consumer space. But basically what is happening there are end users are getting tricked into clicking on things that install things seemingly on to their benefit, but in actuality it's quite malicious. And so the key walkaway point with regard to the alternatives is they don't deal effectively with all of them. They might deal well with one of them, but they're not dealing with them all. And today's enterprise needs to have a solution that stops them all. And one other little point, those two in the middle, non-malware attacks, in-memory attacks, one or both or a combination of the two are also known in the industry as fileless attacks. Fileless attacks. So if you've seen the term fileless, that's actually talking about those two categories. Well, AppGuard stops all of these, and it has done so for many years, and it is very effective. And one thing that's really interesting about it is it doesn't come with all of the penalties or downsides of the alternatives as they try to stop these attacks. There's another trend in the marketplace that's probably caught your eye, and that is a lot of the alternatives, since they're unable to block the attacks as they occur, they're shifting to more detect and react approach. Well, unfortunately, while that might be a great government jobs program, creating lots of jobs in the marketplace for all those analysts and people that have to clean up the mess after the attack has done harm, it isn't very cost effective for the enterprise. And AppGuard's approach is very preventative, and that has tremendous benefits downstream from everything from the endpoint. It basically frees up your IT sec people. You don't have to have an army of analysts interpreting data that's coming from the endpoint. You don't have to be triaging alerts from all of these different sources nearly as much. And of course, AppGuard is not going to prevent some perimeter attacks, such as if your firewall has been compromised, it's not going to protect your firewall. So AppGuard does not stop all attacks on the enterprise, but it does block those that try to go through the endpoints. Another thing that sets AppGuard apart from alternatives is a lot of the alternatives, they depend on what are called indicators of compromise. You can actually think of these as another type of antivirus signature, just kind of more broad in nature. AppGuard has nothing to do with indicators of compromise. In fact, many cybersecurity specialists, what they like about AppGuard is that it, in effect, is providing them a treasure trove of indicators of attack. Think about this. If you're in a detect and react posture, that means some time will pass before you're able to act in response to what's happening. Well, what can happen, and what often does happen in that time, is the adversary, one of the first things he or she does is start destroying the artifacts that got them onto the endpoint. Eliminate evidence that can be used against them, that can arm the defenders to better understand what the adversary is doing. Well, with AppGuard so effective at blocking attacks at the very beginning, it's basically collecting those artifacts, collecting those indicators of attack. And those indicators of attack can be funneled into one's SIM, and ultimately it can be made to make your other cyber controls in the enterprise more effective. So again, as I talked about indicators of compromise, they're basically another form of signature. Well, AppGuard is depending on signatures of no kind, nothing. It simply blocks those unacceptable actions. And it'll become a little more clear to you soon how that happens, what that means. But I think the important takeaway at this point is any kind of endpoint protection that depends on signatures is basically defending against past attacks and vulnerable to future attacks. They can only recognize what has already been seen, because AppGuard does not depend on signatures. It blocks unknown attacks quite easily, and it has done so for years. You might have noticed in the trade rags this past week articles about a new type of in-memory attack that was presented on at Black Hat Europe last week called doppelganging. A very scary attack. Not only do most other endpoint security tools and protection tools fail to block these things, many of them can't even see it. Well, AppGuard has been determined to block these attacks out of the box by default. So once again, AppGuard has adapted to the changing tactics of the adversary without any changes. In fact, that's another important operational consideration when looking at endpoint security tools. How often do we have to update it? And that's another thing that really sets AppGuard apart, is it just naturally adapts to the natural changes that occur on endpoints. Whereas other alternatives such as whitelisting, host-based sandboxing, process virtualization, and even anti-exploit, those other types of endpoint protection mechanisms, they actually begin to fail as endpoints change. They must be adapted. They must be altered. AppGuard doesn't need to know what those changes are, most of those changes. You add a new application to the endpoint, well, then maybe you need AppGuard to get a policy update. But from what you've already installed and as it changes with software updates and patches, generally speaking, you don't have to update AppGuard policy. So that makes AppGuard more operationally friendly, less labor intensive, more adaptive to the changes in the adversary's tactics. And we've literally had customers go months, even over a year, without having to make any policy updates to AppGuard to protect their endpoints. I don't know of any of those other alternatives that can do that in any way. In fact, we have AppGuard protecting ATMs and point-of-sale machines that have very limited network access because of their overall security posture. And a lot of these alternatives, they just cannot cope without having a constant feed of signatures and other types of data or policy tweaks. AppGuard does just fine. You would think with this a highly effective protection there would be a performance penalty, but actually it couldn't be farther from the truth. AppGuard is extremely lightweight, only 760 kilobytes on the hard drive, and some of the alternatives out there are just big and bloated and huge. And the other thing is, you might think that it occupies a lot of CPU, but again, it does not. It doesn't even occupy much RAM at all, whereas others quite different. If you are considering thin client computing in your enterprise or already have, or otherwise known as non-persistent VDI, where the computing is actually done in the data center on servers, and the end user's machine is basically only seeing, you might say, screen sharing of it, figuratively speaking. The hard work is actually done on the server. Well, those things have to be endpoint protected as well, those sessions. And a lot of the alternatives out there, the security penalty is just absolutely unacceptable. In fact, the consortium of Japanese corporations that bought the intellectual property for AppGuard earlier this year, non-persistent VDI is a very important factor for them because they're trying to reap the economic benefits of that type of enterprise computing. And they looked at all of these alternatives, and AppGuard was the only one that satisfied their need for a lightweight, secure solution for those non-persistent VDI solutions. So how does it work? We're not going to be able to spend much time on this, but I hope you'll get a better sense for this when you look at the demonstrations that are about to be shown you. But let's look at this. Microsoft Word. First, from a policy perspective, we were talking about whitelisting, and AppGuard doesn't have to know much. From a policy perspective, AppGuard just needs to know the full path name of Microsoft Word, and that's it. But as you probably know, Microsoft Word isn't some monolithic executable. It's a whole family of executables, libraries, and script engines. With AppGuard, you don't need to know all of those particulars because of its patented adaptive process isolation technology. Basically, when Microsoft Word makes use of a dynamic link library or some child executable, some child process, or script engine, the same restrictions that AppGuard is applying to Microsoft Word, such that Microsoft Word can do whatever it needs to do, except it can't do those things that the hacker wants it to. So Microsoft Word should have no business altering program files in the Windows directory, the program files directory, or sensitive places in the Windows registry. It also shouldn't be injecting code into the memory of other applications. It shouldn't be scraping the memory of other applications. It shouldn't be stealing the credentials from the Windows memory so that they can be used and replayed elsewhere to compromise other endpoints. And so adaptive process isolation is adapting to what Microsoft Word needs to do, yet not allowing Microsoft Word or any of its child executables or any of its child processes to do any of those harmful actions. This isn't just for Microsoft Word, though. This is for any application that you are running on your endpoints that is interacting with the outside world and potentially putting your organization at risk because something it consumes could be harmful. And so this adaptive process isolation is very effective at stopping all of those attacks that we talked about on the earlier slide. So that adaptive process isolation that I was talking about is basically preventing harmful things from getting into system space. That's the place where your end users with local admin rights cannot write into, and that's where most of the sensitive parts of the endpoint are located from a security perspective. But what about user space? That's where a lot of drive-by downloads and such will drop their malicious executables. And in this regard, AppGuard does have a similarity to application whitelisting and some other anti-executable type solutions, but it's just a superficial similarity. And what I mean by this is what goes on in user space by AppGuard or other technologies is they only allow known trustworthy things to launch from user space. So if they match a hash, if their digital signature is right, then they can launch. Well, in application whitelisting, you not only have to specify what is allowed to launch in user space, but you also have to specify what is allowed to launch in system space. The lists are literally hundreds of thousands of items long. With AppGuard, this anti-execution in user space, that's all we have to do is list either those trusted publishers, Microsoft. In fact, the GoToWebinar application on my endpoint was allowed to launch from user space because the digital signature is on a list of trusted publishers within AppGuard policy. But again, that's just the pre-launch control, whether or not something may launch from user space. What sets AppGuard very much apart is what happens after these things are allowed to launch. That's where the adaptive process isolation comes into place. So what you see up here within that bubble is GoToMeeting can do whatever it wants, but if it tries to start making changes to system space, if it starts messing with the memory of other applications, AppGuard blocks it. And that is why AppGuard is so very effective at stopping all four categories of malicious code attacks. So think about how that can slash the costs in your organization or other organizations. Half or more of an enterprise cyber program is directly or indirectly in existence because of what happens at the endpoint. With AppGuard so effectively preventing those malicious code attacks from being successful at the endpoint, all of those other things in the enterprise cyber program experience either radically reduced volume, think of the fewer number of analysts one has to employ, or there are actually areas where they don't have to do anything at all. Another thing that's very important about the way that AppGuard approaches this is 75% of IT practitioners note that they can't keep up with patch management. And that's very significant. Let's go back here for a moment. AppGuard, its very premise is that Microsoft Word could be compromised or hijacked at any given moment. Hence the name of AppGuard. We place Microsoft Word under guard, AppGuard. And so we basically are assuming or treating Windows as an unpatched application. We don't fully trust it. And what that means to you is when it comes to patch management, you don't have to compress that patch cycle down from 30 to 10 days, skipping steps and rushing it out. With AppGuard, you can take your time. You don't have to hire those extra personnel to get through all of those different patches. You don't have to rush out those patches that might disrupt your end users because you weren't able to effectively test them before implementing the patch. AppGuard lets you run your endpoints without having to worry greatly about what might happen if you have an unpatched application out there. We're not recommending or advocating that you don't have to do patch management. We're a layered defense shop too. We believe all of those best practices should be applied. But what we are saying is that AppGuard takes the pressure off of that. So another thing to bear in mind, and I'll just wrap this up real quick now, is that because of this adaptive process isolation, how it adapts to the natural changes of the endpoint, it doesn't have any of the operational overhead of these alternatives, many of which have to be constantly tuned and retuned. AppGuard doesn't need that. Many of these alternatives require human beings to be reading the data events in almost real time, deciding what needs to be done and choosing what, and then acting upon that, and then remediating what happened. With AppGuard, there are no dependencies on people having to do smart things quickly. A log event from AppGuard to your Security Operations Center is more notification of what it has blocked, not an alert of something that you might have to do. So think about how that impacts the cost structure of your enterprise security. And the other thing about AppGuard is it doesn't require specialists to operate. A lot of these tools out there require people that are familiar with machine learning, that understand the nuances of what happens deep inside the endpoint. AppGuard doesn't require any of that. It's quite straightforward. And then I guess lastly I'll just say one of the most pervasive problems in the enterprise has been those employees that just keep clicking on things that they shouldn't click on. Despite the security awareness training, they keep on clicking those things. Well, AppGuard basically removes that dependence on the end user from making smart choices. So, Janan?
Yes, thank you, Eric. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And I think I will need to, if you can give me 1 second. You might need to change yourself from a presenter, Eric. Okay, thank you. Can you all see my screen? Can you see my screen, Eric? Can you see my screen?
Give me a moment. No, I am not seeing your screen.
Okay.
I think I just solved it. My bad. Sorry, folks.
Okay, yes, I don't know. I was unable to share my screen there for a minute. So, does everything show fine now, Eric? I just want to make sure that folks can see the screen for the demo piece.
I am not seeing your screen yet, but...
Not yet. Okay. 1 second. Apologies for this. How about now?
We're good.
Okay,
I'm muting myself.
All right, thank you. In this demo, what we're going to look at is some examples of the different types of attack that we're seeing lately. Eric has referred to some of them in the overview. As you can see here, I am in my virtual machine environment as we will be looking at live malware. I have AppGuard protecting me here on this machine. This is the consumer or personal version of AppGuard in which the end user can easily change the protection settings of AppGuard. With the enterprise version, all of the security policies are managed in our AppGuard Enterprise Management Console. The typical end user will not have the ability to disable AppGuard. All of that will be configured in the management console, and only people with the right level of privileges, for example, a network administrator, can change the policies or change the protection level. So with that being said, the first example that we will be looking at is a malwareless type of attack. And we're seeing, cyber criminals using these types of attacks more and more frequently as they can bypass some of the conventional detection-based methods. I'm going to open the AppGuard activity report, which is where we will see all the event logs or the indicators of attack of all the different processes that are in violation of the security policies that will be recorded here. And with that being said, the first example here is a Word document, as we can see, and it's leveraging macros. I'm going to click on Enable Content here, and what we see pop up on my screen is two things. The first thing here is an alert message from AppGuard letting me know that it stopped a suspicious program from running. And then we see an error message from Windows telling me that the loading of this script has failed. When we look at the AppGuard activity report, as we can see here in more detail, AppGuard prevented it from launching a PowerShell script, not a PowerShell script, just an executable script in this case. And this is something that a typical Word document has no business doing, and it's a very simple, effective way of stopping this type of attack. Even as Eric mentioned earlier, when a typical user might go ahead and click on that link or open that weaponized document, such as this one. And what I will do next is I'm going to take the signature of this malware, the MD5 hash, and do a quick search in VirusTotal against this signature. As you know, VirusTotal tracks different AV providers and vendors, and as we can see here, based on this signature that I just searched, only 54 out of the, only 23, excuse me, out of the 54 AV vendors that are listed here in VirusTotal would have recognized this as malware based on the signature. And as you can see here, this is from December of 2015. And I like to use this older example just to show how ineffective it is to just rely on signature or detection-based approach in order to stop these types of attacks. I'm going to scroll down here a little bit. All of the vendors that you see listed in red are the ones that would have identified this as malware based on the signature. And again, this is from 2015. All of the ones that you see listed in green, though, are ones that wouldn't have stopped this or recognized it as malware. And these include some of the, well-known vendors out there, from Malwarebytes to Panda to Kaspersky and others. So this was one example. I'm going to show you another example of a weaponized document. And the next one that I'm going to show you in a minute, let me first clear the activity report here so we can start fresh. This is an actual example that one of our clients received. It's an attack. It was a highly targeted phishing attack that looked pretty legitimate. And in this case, the cyber criminal went through the extra step of password protecting the Word file attachment and providing the password in order to open the document. Now, because this was password protected all the way through, it was encrypted, and it was not identified or blocked or stopped by any of the best-of-breed security defense solutions that this client had in place. Now, the recipient, because this was a password-protected file, didn't even think twice before opening the document and entering the password, which I happen to know. And again, in this case, this document is leveraging macros in order to launch the attack. I'm going to go ahead and click on Enable Content. And as we see, I got the alert message from AppGuard letting me know that it stopped the suspicious program from running. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And then also the error message here from Windows saying that it couldn't find the executable because AppGuard stopped it in the first place. And let's take a closer look at the activity report, or the indicators of attack that we see here. This is a pretty sophisticated attack that first tried to write. It first tried to write to the registry. It then tried to launch a PowerShell script, and AppGuard is stopping it every step of the way. Even though the recipient in this case went ahead, entered the password, and clicked on Enable Content just like I did, she was still protected. And again, this particular client had many other best-of-breed solutions. They believed in a layered security approach, and none of the other solutions they had in place were able to alert them to this attack. Thankfully, they did have AppGuard. When she opened the document in this case, it was just a blank document that had nothing in it. So she was suspicious about it, sent it over to us, to our team, for review. And I'm going to do exactly what we did before as far as taking the signature for this malware and copying the MD5 hash here. And let's go back and do another quick search here in VirusTotal. And the last time I checked, still today, none of the AV providers that VirusTotal is tracking would have identified this based on the signature as malware. And this is about almost 18 months old now that we were alerted to this by our client. As you can see here, this is a pretty persistent attack that's continuously trying to do, you know, different things. And again, any process that is in violation of the security policies of what you know, actions where it should be doing or should not be doing, AppGuard is stopping these at the process level. So what you see here are not incidents that you need to respond to. It's not a reactive solution. Again, it's a preventative, much more proactive solution than what other AV, for example, or other things provide. So with that being said, I'm going to clear the event log here and move to another example that I want to show you. And this is an example of a memory type of attack. We're going to be looking today at Poseidon. And as you can see here, I have a lot of different applications that I'm working on. I have some important image files here, a PowerPoint presentation I'm planning for the board, a proposal that I'm working on, and let me go ahead and open this one here. Let's say a P&L projection spreadsheet, very sensitive. Financial data that I certainly don't want to get in the wrong hands or in the hands of cyber criminals. And we see memory type of attacks being used either in, you know, for credential thefts and or in cyber espionage, for example, type of attacks. So with that being said, as you can see here, I have AppGuard protecting me. I have the AppGuard activity report open. And I'm going to launch Poseidon. And what we will see happen immediately is that Poseidon is going to try and scan all of the different processes and applications that I have running. And will try to read the memory in order to steal my data. And AppGuard is going to prevent it every step of the way, as we can see here. And meanwhile, I can continue on doing my business, my work normally. For example, I can continue on updating my spreadsheet here with the latest financial data and numbers that I have. My data is safe, it's protected, and it's never, AppGuard is never going to let Poseidon read the memory of my applications. As we can see here, it's going through all the different applications and processes that I have running and stopping it every way, every step of the way. Because it is such a small footprint of less than 1 megabyte, as Eric mentioned earlier, it's not interfering with my ability to continue, you know, working normally. It's very, very transparent and elegant solution that is simple yet very effective at blocking these types of attack. The next example that I will show you is an example of a ransomware attack. And I'm going to move to my other window here. Let me close this. And for the purposes of the demo today, we're going to launch WannaCry. But whatever ransomware you can think of, whether it's TeslaCrypt or Petya, not Petya, Bad Rabbit, or others, AppGuard will block it day 0. And in fact, when just talking about WannaCry, one of our partners who was doing a proof of concept of AppGuard a few months back in May of this year, they were hit by WannaCry. And on day 0, the only endpoints that were not infected by the ransomware were the ones where they had AppGuard deployed. So with that being said, I'm going to open the activity reports here, the AppGuard activity reports, so we can see what happens when I launch WannaCry with AppGuard protecting me on this machine. As you can see here, I have my pictures folder open. Imagine this is sensitive data information. I just want to show you that none of my files here are going to be encrypted. So let's go ahead and launch WannaCry. As we can see, immediately AppGuard prevented it from writing to the registry and from being able to encrypt any of my files. We're going to do the same thing here, but before I launch WannaCry in this window, I want to disable AppGuard on this machine. So with that being said, I'm going to change the protection level. Again, this is the consumer version, so I can easily do that. So as you can see, I am no longer protected on this machine here. And let me go ahead and open the pictures folder like we did in the other view, so we can see exactly what happens when I launch the ransomware, WannaCry in this case, on this machine without AppGuard protecting me. And I'm sure you're all aware of ransomware, as it has become, one of the more popular attack vectors for cyber criminals. And I think this trend is going to continue into 2018, especially with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin gaining more and more traction. And as we can see here, immediately what's starting to happen is the ransomware made encrypted copies of my images, and it will eventually delete all of the actual data, and I will be left with nothing but the encrypted files here. I would have no choice but either, pay the ransom to get the decryption key, as we can see here in the message that just popped up on my screen. In this case, $300 worth of Bitcoin to be sent to this address, and giving me the deadline of when to make the payment, or else I would lose my data. And as we all know, even with a good backup strategy, just the operational and business impact, once you are hit with ransomware, and it's an immediate impact, it is pretty significant, and it can impact, operations and interrupt the ability for business to continue as normal. When we look back at the other window where AppGuard is protecting me, again, even when I launched WannaCry here, as you can see, none of my data is impacted. All my files are fine. None of them is encrypted, and I can continue with my work as normal. So with that being said, I would like to open the floor for any questions that you may have at this point. And let me go ahead and unmute everyone so we can have a more interactive question and answer session at this point.
Yes, Janan, can AppGuard work with other EDR or AV solutions if they're already in place today?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, AppGuard, because of the fact that it sits low at the kernel level and it has such a small footprint, it can work very well with other solutions. Several of our large enterprise customers, believe in having more than one solution for a layered security approach, and AppGuard can work very well with other AVs, for example, or EDR solutions that you may have in place. Great question.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, if you do have any questions or would like additional information as a follow-up to our webinar today, we certainly would like to provide that to you. And we will be sending you a recording, which will be available of the webinar, so you can share that with team members. We'd like to thank you all again for taking the time to be with us for our webinar today. and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.